I will turn it over to Becky Morgan, who is a NICOA project coordinator, to give you the history of the American Indian Alaskan Native voting. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us in our little learning community that we're creating today. We're really happy to be here. I originally asked Dr. Daniel Littlefield to handle this part of the presentation, but he wasn't able to join. If you are able to, please check out the website for the archive that he runs. It's the Sequoia National Research Center in Little Rock, Arkansas. It's a fascinating place. Some of the highlights are that they have a lot of tribal newspapers there, a huge collection. They also have something called the Modern Warriors of World War I. It's a database to identify all of the 12,000 American Indian servicemen that served during World War I. So very interesting. There's a lot to cover today, and it's a bit like Guido Sarducci's 5-Minute University. So we'll be going through a lot, but I think it'll be fun. Next slide, please. We want to thank AARP and Kauffman and Associates. Without their support and help, we couldn't do this presentation. We're so honored and thrilled to be able to do this, and thank you so much for your support. Next slide. National Indian Council on Aging is a 40-year-old organization, over 40 years actually. Our mission is to provide comprehensive health, social services, and economic well-being for American Indian and Alaska Native elders. We're a membership-based group. We have a job training program called CSEP, which is the Senior Community Service Employment Program. We have a project we're looking at long-term services and supports. We have the American Indian Technical Assistance and Resource Center. We're working on a diverse elders caregiving project, and most of all, we have our conference, which we have postponed this year, but it will be happening again in August of 2021. Next slide. I watched a video recently called Warrior Women, and it's about Madonna Thunderhawk and her daughter, and it looks at the history of Madonna's life, and in the 70s, she started a survival school. I think that that's kind of an interesting idea, that maybe something that we're doing today is similar, in that we, in order to survive, we need to remember our history, we need to look to the past, and we need to plan for the future. So thank you. Next slide. So as I was looking at voting rights, I kept digging and digging, and human rights was something that kind of was at the very basis of this. As you can see, on the left there, there's the Declaration of Independence, and the idea of human rights is a topic still being debated, but it's about fundamental rights. It seems to be that most people agree that they apply to everyone just because they're human, and it tends to include social, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. As I say, still being debated, but as you remember, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness were in the Declaration of Independence and were meant to apply to all American citizens. Next slide, please. So civil rights are rights within those human rights that protect an individual's freedom, and one of those is that it entitles us to participate in the civil and political life of our society without discrimination or repression, and it tends to focus on the things that have been denied to people, like good education or good housing or public accommodation, but it also includes the right to get together, to assemble, to petition, and the right to vote. Okay, next slide. Voting rights is a key part of any democracy, and Chief Justice Earl Warren said that the right to vote freely for a candidate of one's choice is of the essence of a democratic society, and any restrictions on that right strike at the heart of representative government. Next slide. But the reality is much messier, and as Grant Hayden said, we haven't made progress towards universal political participation. It's been littered with periods of expansion and retraction to lots of groups of voters. American Indians and Alaska Natives are just one of those many groups. Next slide. And I know a lot of you probably know this already, but the Iroquois Confederacy back in 1142 is the oldest living participatory democracy on Earth. In 1988, the Senate paid tribute to that with a resolution acknowledging that the original 13 colonies were influenced by the political system developed by the Iroquois Confederacy. So those democratic principles were incorporated into the Constitution. So I think that it's important to remember that when the white European people landed on the shores of America, democracy was already in action here. Next slide, please. Deciding who an Indian is and how to affirm and describe people as Indian is another topic that's been debated and discussed. And I remember when I was in my Native American Studies class in the 70s, they talked about who is an Indian. The Constitution acknowledged tribes as sovereign entities, meaning that they could govern themselves and make decisions. Later rulings with the Marshall Court said that tribes are domestic dependent nations. So a nation within a nation, really. The federal government's policy in general over time has been to try to assimilate Indians into the larger society and give up their tribal identity. And the phrase, I think, was kill the Indian and save the man. Next slide. All right, so we're going to try and go through a timeline from 1776. The Constitution did not give people the right to vote. It acknowledged that, but each state was left to come up with its own way of doing that. And as you're probably aware, at the very beginning, white males were usually the ones that they thought of were the ones who were able to make those decisions and vote. And that is, where we started. Then in 1870, the 15th Amendment extended the right to vote to all races, but again, they found ways to hinder that with poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses. The next slide. During the same time, the boarding school system was set up, and Carlisle is just one example of a boarding school my great-grandfather went to. It's a military-style boarding school, and there were horrific hardships. There's no question that the boarding school era was traumatic and horrible, but it also was a place where Indians met other Indians from different tribes. And this pan-Indianism idea began to emerge where people got together and started to talk and became friends. And they formed societies that were intended to try to uplift Native peoples. The Dawes Act was an effort to turn Indians into farmers with a plot of land, a lot of people who had never farmed in their lives, but it allowed them to settle the lands that they gave, that were then freed up, were called excess lands and were given to white settlers. And I think another aspect of that was that they had to renounce their tribal membership. In 1911, the Society of American Indians was formed, and again, that pan-Indian unity that the boarding schools gave birth to helped to call for citizenship in 1914. That is a long time ago. Then in 1920, as you know, this is the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment that granted women the right to vote. Next slide. In 1924, Congress passed legislation that extended citizenship and voting rights to American Indians. But again, many states found ways to deny those rights. And this is my editorial comment, but I believe that a lot of states were afraid that they had so many Native peoples that if those peoples joined together, they would be a very effective voting bloc. And denying those rights was a way to hinder that. In 1944, the National Congress of American Indians was established. And in 1945, Alaska adopted an anti-discrimination law. So very ahead of their time in that. This is something I've been trying to learn more about, but it says here Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah were the last states to extend voting rights. I may need to revise this because the more I look, the more I find different states were doing different things. And some states were keeping people from voting as far as into 1975. So I need to look into this further and find out more. And if people that are listening know more information, I'd love to know more. In 1964, the 24th Amendment prohibited the use of poll taxes for federal elections. Next slide, please. So the Voting Rights Act was huge. If anybody's been listening to the history about John Lewis's life, really played an important part in that. It allowed, or it stopped the barriers to political participation for racial and ethnic minorities, literacy tests, discriminatory districting, and registration practices. 68 was the Indian Civil Rights Act, and then they lowered the voting age to 18. 1970s was the end of determination policy and the beginning of Indian self-determination. They further amended the Voting Rights Act to include language minority citizens, and then in 82 allowed for assistance to blind, disabled, or illiterate voters. All right, next slide, please. I want to highlight two trailblazing pioneers. This woman, her English name was Gertrude Simmons Bonin, and I hope I'm saying this correctly, Zitkala Sa, which translates to red bird. And those are her dates from 1876 to 1938, Yankton, Dakota, and a very interesting woman. She wrote an Indian opera about the Sundance. She was a member of the Society of American Indians that worked toward preserving Native culture. And she thought Native people should be citizens and have the right to vote. And as early as 1924, ran a voter registration drive. Just an interesting woman, kind of brought to the fore because of the history of women and voting with the 19th Amendment. All right, next slide, please. And here's an Alaska Native hero. Her name is Elizabeth Petroyevich. She's Tlingit, and she was the president of the Alaska Native Sisterhood and helped fight for the championing the anti-discrimination law in 1945. This quote is kind of lovely. Have you eliminated larceny or murder by passing a law against it? No law will eliminate crimes, but at least you as legislators can assert to the world that you recognize the evil of the present situation and speak your intent to help us overcome discrimination. Next slide. Our next speaker is going to tell you quite a bit about the current situation, so I'm just going to give you a brief overview here. The things that I've been reading about Alaska Natives and voting, again, point to the part that organizations have played in building a sense of working for those civil rights and voting rights that every citizen is entitled to. The Alaska Native Brotherhood was formed in 1912. And then the Alaska Native Sisterhood followed in 1915 and advocated for citizenship and racial justice. The biggest theme I've noticed in my very cursory examination of this subject, and I know that our next speaker will be able to answer more questions on that, but the election materials were not always well translated into Alaska Native languages. The barriers that are presented because Alaska is such a huge state have been huge. For example, for someone who wants to vote, I was reading a bit about that. It said that someone would show up with all the materials and get on to the loudspeaker and announce to everyone that if they wanted to vote, they needed to come over and they would vote. And then she would pack up her materials, get in a Jeep or something, and then go over to the river and get in a boat and go to the next place, and then get a marine radio or something and make an announcement, and everyone would come out and they would vote. And she would do a circuit like that everywhere in that area. And there's some places in Alaska, at least when I was just reading this, that don't have any polling places, or that just have to travel huge distances in order to vote. So the questions and the challenges there are just immense. All right, next slide. As I say, I'm going to defer to our next speaker. There's a lot of people that are wanting to vote, that want to know how to overcome these barriers, but they are getting organized and doing lots to make progress towards that goal. The next slide. Here are some important organizations that have been advocating for voting rights. The National Congress of American Indians has a Native Vote campaign, 4 Directions, and the Native American Rights Fund has been in this for quite a while, working in Alaska, working in all over Indian country. Next slide. So here you see Sharice Davids and Deb Holland and some young kids working a table trying to sign people up to vote and take the census. We've been making a lot of progress. There's still challenges. I think participatory democracy is a traditional Native value, as you saw with the Iroquois Confederacy. So by voting, I think we honor our ancestors. The next slide. I thank you very much for your time.